When they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them, and they said,
"This is what Pharaoh says. I will not give you any more straw. Go and get your own straw, wherever you can find it, but your work will not be reduced at all."
So the people scattered all over Egypt to gather stubble to use for straw.
The slave drivers kept pressing them, saying,
"Complete the work required of you for each day, just as when you had straw."
And Pharaoh's slave drivers beat the Israelite overseers they had appointed, demanding,
"Why haven't you met your quota of bricks yesterday or today as before?"
Then the Israelite overseers went and appealed to Pharaoh.
Why have you treated your servants this way? Your servants are given no straw, yet we are told, make bricks. Your servants are being beaten, but the fault is with your own people.
Pharaoh said,
"Lazy. That's what you are, lazy. That is why you keep saying, 'Let us go and sacrifice to the Lord.' Now get to work. You will not be given any straw, yet you must produce your full quota of bricks."
The Israelite overseers realized they were in trouble when they were told,
"You are not to reduce the number of bricks required of you for each day."
When they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them, and they said,
"May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us."
Moses returned to the Lord and said,
"Why, Lord? Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he's brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all."
Then the Lord said to Moses,
"Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of this country."
The Lord said to Moses,
"Tell Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the streams and canals, over the ponds and all the reservoirs, and they will turn to blood. Blood will be everywhere in Egypt, even in vessels of wood and stone."
Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water turned into blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt.
This story is filled with suffering. It's filled with oppression. I mean, if we look at this and we really pay attention to what's going on, we recognize that God is oppressing Pharaoh. Pharaoh is oppressing the Hebrews, and the Hebrews are oppressing Moses. Everywhere we look, we see oppression and suffering. The burning bush, well, that story's over. Moses has answered the call, and Aaron has linked up with him, and they've gone to Pharaoh and they've said, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh looks at them and laughs. "Why would I respect your God? Why would I respect the God of these people that have been slaves to me for years?" Ha, really? And then he reacts as any good oppressor would. He turns up the pressure. If we don't think about a playground bully, shouts across the way for some child to sort of get out of his way or to move, and someone stands in his way, what is the first thing that the playground bully does? He steps in, he leans in, makes himself look bigger, and he acts more aggressively. He turns up the heat. He puts on the pressure so that he can keep the system that he's within just the way he wants it to be, where he is in control and he has all of the power. Anytime we stand against oppression in some way, we can be sure that we are going to get pushback, that we're going to get someone very aggressive telling us to our faces how terrible a thing this is going to be if we keep pushing. So the Hebrews, they're told by the slave drivers, by the slave masters, you have to make all of the same amount of bricks that you've been making, but oh, by the way, we're not going to give you any straw. And if you can't get the job done, you're going to be beaten. So they go out and they are picking up stubble from all over the place. They're going out on the ground, they're going on the roadways, the walkways, and they're picking up all the straw that they can find. I would imagine if they had straw in their beds in some way, they were pulling it out of those places so that they could make all of the bricks that they possibly could. And suddenly they start pointing fingers. They are doing what the oppressed do. This is human nature. The abused woman, when she stands up and then is abused even harder or worse, suddenly starts pointing fingers at others. Well, you're the one that told me to say something. You're the one that told me to stand up. Everything was fine just the way it was. That's the way the Hebrews are reacting. You know, everything was great when we had enough straw to make the bricks and nobody was beating us. Slavery was just fine. We were okay with it. This is the same group that just weeks before, at least in our sermon series, we don't really know how much time it was, but just before, had been praying to God, God, please come and set us free. But being set free is hard work sometimes. Ask someone that's addicted to nicotine. You start to pull away, you stop smoking cigarettes, and what happens? Anxiety sets in, depression sets in, headaches, shaking hands, cravings. Breaking free from oppression is painful and it is scary. And our tendency, our response is to step back and say, you know what, things were pretty good just the way they were. I don't know why I even bothered doing this. But they also, these Hebrews, pointed their fingers at Moses and said, Moses, you are the one that brought all of this upon me. What in the world is wrong with you, Moses? So now Moses is being oppressed, and Moses turns around and looks at God and says, God, this is what I told you would happen. Oh, I am, God. You are the great I am. Well, I took the great I am to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh laughed at me. Pharaoh said, I am the great leader of slaves. So much suffering, so much pain, so much anger and frustration and brokenness in the scripture. It's kind of depressing as I was working on it throughout the week, and I said, okay, let's look at suffering. Let's look at what the Bible says about suffering. And I plugged the word suffering into my little database, and it struck me what I found. In Romans 5:1, Romans 5, actually I'm going to look at verse 2, the middle of verse 2, verse 3 and 4. Paul says to us, we boast in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. Really, Paul? In 2 Corinthians 4, he says, 4:8 through 10, we are hard pressed on every side, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but we're not in despair. We're persecuted, but we're not abandoned. We are struck down, but we are not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. And James, I love the way James puts things so bluntly sometimes. James says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters. This is in chapter 1. Whenever you face trials of any kind, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. We're supposed to consider our suffering to be pure joy. Yuck. Sort of like our parents telling us to go clean our rooms. But yet somehow in our heart of hearts we know this is kind of true, right? I think that Christianity throughout the years has had lots of ebbs and flows and lots of different things that we've taught. One of the things that Christianity has been teaching, I fear, is that to follow Jesus means that our life won't have any more problems. That following Jesus means that we'll get all the things in life that we want, and life will be wonderful and great and joyful and just, daisies and rainbows all the time. I think we preach that message to entice people, to get people to come into the doors, to follow Jesus. But yet, Jesus tells us that we're to take up our cross and follow him. Jesus promises us that there will be suffering. Promises us that there will be suffering. Says that if you stand up in my name, people are going to come after you. It's going to happen. No, if we preach that sermon, nobody's going to want to come to church. It'll be fascinating to see how many of you are back next week. But we know it. Athletes put themselves through suffering to get better all the time. This is what we do. Or we eat broccoli because it's good for us. We do things to create suffering in our lives because we know that suffering in some way often leads to courage, stronger faith, greater compassion. Now, I want to throw out a couple of asides as I talk about this suffering and the value of it. I want to say, number one, besides maybe in athletics and sort of pushing ourselves out in ministry, I think we need to really be careful of sort of trying to say that we want to pursue suffering. We never want to seek suffering. You don't want to jump off of a 2-story building hoping to break your leg so you can experience suffering because that will somehow draw you closer to God. The fact of the matter is, there's enough suffering in this broken world, and it's going to come to us whether we like it or not. It's out there, and it's all over, and it's going to be a part of our experience because we're human beings. Suffering is part of sort of our existence. We don't want to seek suffering for suffering's sake. But maybe it's time to have a little bit of a different outlook on suffering. We also don't want to, this is part of the aside, we don't want to always jump to the conclusion that God brings suffering into our lives to help us to learn or to grow. Now, this is what I'm saying. I'm saying that suffering helps us to learn and grow, but I don't think that God has to make that happen. Too often I hear people say, this is what I'm going through, God is testing me, or God has brought this into my life to make my life better. I mean, that paints a picture to me of a kind of a terrible God that says, I'm going to bring cancer into your life, or I'm going to bring death into your life so that you'll grow. I'm going to do these terrible things to you because I know it's going to make you better. I think God knows that those things are going to happen, but God is in them. And God can make and will make good happen out of any and every situation that happens in our lives. God is making things new. God is changing things. When we look to Jesus, we will find new birth and resurrection. I was listening this week to a couple messages that I found online. One was by a woman by the name of Sarah Bessey. You don't need to know any of these names, but I feel like I need to give credit where credit is due. Sarah writes articles for Christianity Today and Christian blogs and other places. Sarah said that she believes that we as Christian people need to find a way to lean into our suffering. Instead of treating it like something that needs to be defeated and destroyed as quickly as possible so we can move on to joy again in our lives, we need to lean in, recognizing that on the other side of suffering is new birth. I think I've mentioned this quote before, but it's worth mentioning again, at least it is in my own experience and in my life. But Barbara Brown Taylor, who is a theologian, phenomenal preacher, wrote a book recently, and she said that she thinks we need to start looking at life, all of life, as if every moment is for us and not against us. Now, how often do we find ourselves thinking, oh, again, I've got this suffering, I've got this thing coming at me, and I've got to destroy it, I've got to beat it down and just get rid of it as quickly as I can. But what if we looked at things and said, God, where are you in this? How is this suffering for me, God? Where can I learn? How will this make me become more compassionate? How will this grow my faith? How will this give me more courage and hope in my life? Now again, maybe another aside. Sometimes in the midst of the suffering, in the midst of what we're going through, this is stuff that we can't even comprehend. And I'm not encouraging that we go around to our friend who's fighting some sort of disease or who's just lost a loved one and say, hey, it's time for you to lean into your suffering and really kind of become more conscious of where God is in the midst of this. We all have to go through a time where we just put our fist up to God and say, why? But somewhere on the other side of that why, somewhere on the other side of that morning is the opportunity to become more conscious, to become more awake to where God is and where God is moving. I wonder to myself, what if the characters in this story, would have looked to see where God was moving them? Or what might they have thought or recognized? Where did they recognize God years later? And I thought about Pharaoh. Think about poor Pharaoh who held on with clenched fists all the way to the bitter end as that water was crashing over his head. What if he had repented? What if he would have let go? What if he would have respected God, knowing that God was more powerful than him? What if he would have done something crazy like formed some sort of relationship with the Hebrews and said, hey, let's build this community together? What if he would have surrendered to God? How would this story have been completely different? And I thought about the Hebrews. They said, suffering really did its work with the Hebrews. Suffering for them encouraged them, gave them courage, strengthened them to push forward and to get free from the oppression. Yeah, they fought it every step of the way. But it was those memories of slavery, the hard times, the struggles that gave them the courage and the strength to take those steps out into the wilderness, into the unknown, following God. And I thought about Moses, and I said, Moses, all this suffering that you're going through, everybody's pointing their fingers at you, and you're feeling so sorry for yourself. Well, what if you could have just trusted God and assured the Hebrews? Maybe the leaving was better. I don't know. Only Moses can really tell us what he learned and how he grew from that experience. But we see a man whose faith gets stronger and stronger after each struggle, after each challenge that he goes through. I started to think to myself, okay, well, what about the things in my life? What about the challenges? What about the suffering? And how do we see God in those places? How do we see God moving? And I thought about my uncle. And I said, Jerry was so young. What could we possibly get from his passing the way that he did? But I thought about it and I thought, for many of us family members, we have so much more compassion now for someone else who's going through something like this. If we run into someone whose family member is experiencing Parkinson's or some rare disease and we're watching them fade, we can, with tears in our eyes, look at them and know with a true understanding what we've been through, what they have been through, what they're going through. Suffering creates compassion. And I thought about 3 young men that have stepped into a leadership role that maybe they wouldn't have gotten. And it, in some way, man, I just feel like God, couldn't have it have happened some other way. And it probably could have, but again, this is God making good out of a bad situation. It's God moving and working to bring life and new birth. And I think about a friend of mine that had cancer. And I've never seen anybody that was more compassionate, more loving to others that have gone through the same thing with her. And I think, the suffering, man, we do not like it. But there's something there when we look to our God and say, God, where are you in this? How do we lean in? How do we find you in these places? And the so what of this sermon in so many ways for each of us is to say, how do we look back? Maybe right now you are in a really good place, but you've had experiences of suffering. Can we take the time this week to look back and say, where was God in the midst of that? Where were you, God? What did I learn? How have I grown? How has my faith become stronger because of what I've been through? Or maybe right now you are in the midst of it. Maybe right now you are in that place. Maybe right now you so badly want to get pregnant and you can't. Or maybe right now you don't want to be and you are. Or maybe right now you're experiencing relationship struggles that you never believed could possibly happen. Or maybe right now you're dealing with an illness that you thought you were way too big for. Again, we need to take those times to be angry. We need to take those times to mourn. But somewhere on the other side is the opportunity to say, God, where are you in this? How are you calling me to grow? How are you calling me to be more faithful? Are you calling me, Jesus, to surrender, to let go, because I am not anywhere nearly as strong as you are? Where are you in the midst of this? James says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. 2 Corinthians 4:8. We are hard pressed on every side, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but we are not in despair. We are persecuted, but we are not abandoned. We are struck down, but we are not destroyed. We are always carrying around in our body Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our bodies. Jesus is with us. No matter what we go through, no matter what suffering we experience, Christ is walking with us, holding our hands, and leading us through. And we are going to be okay. And maybe, just maybe, on the other side will be even better.